In the early 1970s, in North Carolina, was a young fancier named Lonzo Pratt who was just starting in dog game and was purchasing and breeding some well-bred dogs from known dog men. He had purchased a young tested jit from J. La Posa by the name of Faye, who was sold because she turned cold and wouldn't start for Jack Kelly and was left on La Posa's yard by Pete Sparks. After numerous breedings, Lonzo struck fame from one breeding that contained 3 males and 2 females. The 2 females were Lena and Rosie, the males were Crush, Vindicator, and Zero. Of the 3 males, Zero and Vindicator would distinguish themselves as great match dogs. The better of the 2 was Zero, as ZEBO was originally named, who gained his fame as a match dog and producer. In all, this black 40 to 44 pounds dog won a total of 7 contract matches, thus becoming a registered grand champion, a Register of Merit sire, and a member of the Bulldog Hall of Fame, the only dog to be recognized by these 3 honors. ZEBO's career began on the yard of Lesser Hughes, the Mountain Man, where he won 4 times, all quick kills. After his 4th he was shipped to the yard of Grady Cummings, and while there, Cummings' Red Fox made the mistake of getting off his leash and ran into ZEBO and was killed. Grady then made Lester get ZEBO off of his yard. ZEBO was then sold to Dave Adams of Ohio, of whom ZEBO was best associated with. At first Mr. Hughes hadn't intended on selling ZEBO, but Mr. Adams came up with enough money to change his mind. His most noted match was against Gr.Ch. and how both sides thought they had trapped the other side by running in an ace on their opponent's average dog. How wrong they both were. Champion ZEBO was the black dog and Champion Gr.Ch was the brindle. How they came to meet on a cool night in a barn in Ohio, is a complicated but interesting story. Champion Gr.Ch was being campaigned at 44 pounds in and around Oklahoma, and Champion ZEBO was being matched around North Carolina at 40 pounds. Gr.Ch was an extremely smart defensive type of dog that could really bite. He'd gained his deserved reputation by proving this in his first 4 matches against dogs that were not pushovers. Likewise, so had ZEBO. The difference being ZEBO's matches were short ones, lasting only 22, 26, 17 and 33 minutes, all kills. After his 4th win, a man named Adams bought ZEBO and took him back up north to Ohio. Adams had a friend named Hudson who had matched a dog at 44 pounds and to a father and son team from St. Louis. Hudson's dog was from Maurice Carver, and was a 2-time winner at 44 pounds named Tex. Hudson was a nice fellow but could really get on your nerves bragging so much on his dog, because it was Tex this and Tex that, for as long as you would listen. I guess the team from St. Louis got tired of listening and just figured they would whip old Tex and shut Hudson up. Now, when you matched into this father and son team, you had better do 3 things: get a good dog, have the dog in good shape, and say your favorite prayer. As luck, or fate, or whatever you desire to call it goes, Tex got hurt in a chain fight and Hudson was going to have to pay the forfeit. Rather than give away money, he called Adams and offered Adams a deal. If Adams would take over the match with ZEBO and win, Hudson would split the winnings with him, and, if he lost, Hudson would pay the whole bet. Adams had been walking ZEBO and cutting his weight, for at that time there was a big convention in Mexico being matched up and Adams had turned ZEBO's weight in. The Mexican convention was supposed to be the biggest and best ever put on, but the law intervened and it never did come about. Adams didn't know the convention would fall apart, but he thought that as he had almost 3 months until the Mexican convention and Texas match was only 3 weeks away, that he could take over Texas match and win without getting hurt too much and still be healthy and set ZEBO down in the Mexican convention. So, he agreed to take over the match, but told his backer that if ZEBO wasn't way ahead at 30 minutes he was going to pick him up, because he wanted to match him in the big convention. Hudson agreed to this, as with ZEBO's kill record. He would rather gamble and give up a few pounds to make it number 5 than give up the forfeit. Meanwhile, out in St. Louis, the team had a dog that was considered to be the best 44-pounder of his time. This Gr.Ch had started out being called Eubanks Gr.Ch. If my information is correct, Eubanks campaigned Gr.Ch in his first 4 matches. All wins over some highly regarded opponents. Gr.Ch had given his fans real reason to call him the best 44-pounder alive, as his opponents were good caliber dogs like Maloney's Alligator and Mayfield's Go Devils. The team purchased Gr.Ch especially for the Tex match since Old Tex was a good dog in his own rights, and the team knew they had to have an above-average dog in order to beat Tex. How and why the team got Gr.Ch is only hearsay on my part. The point is Gr.Ch was the best 44-pounder alive. And he was the dog they had to use on Tex, so we have the stage set. The Ohio boys have an ace named ZEBO, which the team doesn't know about. And the team has an ace named Gr.Ch tuning up that the Ohio boys don't know about. Then it became time to put up or shut up for old ZEBO, for Adams announced he was taking over Hudson's match. The night of the Battle of Champions arrived, with only Gr.Ch's side knowing now that they were going into ZEBO. When they arrived, they wanted to see this killer dog they were matched into and laughingly said, "He don't look like no killer to us." Adams, nor any of his backers, knew ZEBO was going into a 4x winner. They should have suspected something, for fanciers from out west had driven all the way to Ohio to see Gr.Ch knock off this killer dog. Jimmy Jobe, the editor of Pitdog Report, a Mayfield magazine for bulldogs, drove all the way and didn't even mention the match in his magazine. This match was one of the best kept secrets in the dog world, and when the story of it taking place did start to circulate, the match was downplayed. The first report of it anywhere, that I am or was aware of, was in Richard Stratton's book. When you read the account, it tends to make you believe ZEBO got lucky and hurt Gr.Ch bad at the beginning of the match. This is false, as Gr.Ch was on all fours late in the fight. When the dogs were weighed, ZEBO weighed just over 40 pounds. Gr.Ch hit the scales at exactly 44 pounds. As Adams circulated among his backers before the match, he reminded everyone that he was giving up 4 pounds and was going to pick ZEBO up at 30 minutes because he'd only worked him for 3 weeks and 4 pounds was too much to spot. As they released the two champions, you could bet all you wanted on ZEBO and get odds of 3-1 or 300 against Euro 100. As bets were laid and odds were taken, the name Gr.Ch started to finally slip out. ZEBO's backers were aware finally that this was not going to be a walkover. People started to worry about their bet because Adams had warned that he was gone at 30 if ZEBO wasn't way ahead. Adams said later, when Dogman and Johnson called me to the side of the pit at about the 5-minute mark, and told me they recognized the brindle dog as Ch. Gr.Ch, any thought of picking ZEBO up at 30 minutes was gone. I knew I would let him battle as long as he had any chance to win. I realized that I didn't have to go to Mexico to prove that ZEBO was a great dog. The chance had come to me. As the match progressed, it could be basically reported in 2 sentences. Gr.Ch is extremely smart on defense and punishes ZEBO bad about the head. ZEBO is extremely smart on getting to the brisket and punishes Gr.Ch bad in the chest. That is how close the match was. You would think that the 4 pounds would tip the scales in Gr.Ch's favor, but ZEBO was ever so gradually getting a little bit deeper in the chest, and even though Gr.Ch was as smart as ever relying on defense, he was forced to allow ZEBO in more often as the match grew older. The following is an accurate account of the match as can be made, but remember as you read this excerpt from Mr. Stratton's book, that in this writer's opinion, and I was there, ZEBO took Gr.Ch down a notch at a time over the entire match, where here it tends to make you think that Gr.Ch was destroyed early. Unfortunately, ZEBO attacked Mr. Adams' son and nearly took his son's ear off. After the request of Mr. Adams' wife, ZEBO was sold again, this time to Mr. Johnson, who fought him twice more. The last time to a son of his litter-mate brother, Vindicator. Mr. Johnson hoped to get another match in, but was unable to find any takers, despite the fact that ZEBO was past 7 at this point. Thus, ZEBO was retired to stud, and lived to the age of 13, siring his last litter days before his death. He had lost sight at the end, due to the extensive damage he sustained, for no dog was ever able to get to his rear. During the time of ZEBO's career as a match dog, there were 2 other dogs in his weight class that too was making names for themselves, Stinson and Glover's Gr. Champion Art and Giroux Champion Gunner, 4x winner. It was planned to have a round robin for the title of the greatest match dog, whereas each dog would go into each other to prove who was the greatest match dog. Each of these great dogs were relatively close to each other in regard to location. But, for whatever reasons, and hearsay has provided many, the matches never materialized. Vindicator was a red-nosed dog that many, who had witnessed him matched, contend he was a better dog than ZEBO. He was a two-time winner, winning each in identical times of 1:30. One of those victories was over Finley's champion Bo. He lost his third to Gr.Ch's ace. Vindicator died at a young age of heartworms. Rosie, like Vindicator, was also red-nosed, but was never formally matched, though she was tested for 110. She simply was considered to get too valuable as a brute bitch. She lived to the age of 10, dying also of heartworms a month after her last litter. ZEBO produced Steps champion Willie and Adams champion Katie when bred to Tom's Spider ROM. Champion Willie was, as said by some, to have the same destructive force of his sire, by killing each of his opponents in times of 27, 54, and 29 minutes. Others produced by ZEBO were Champion Ruby, Champion Abuelita, Champion Zipper, Champion Diamond Jim, Clemens 2XWZ Boy, Nigger Tobe, Supernats 2XW Blackie and Hughesgetter, just to name a few of the good dogs he sired. He is the grandsire to some great ones like Doc's champion Mo, who was a grand champion until he ran into Red B's champion Charlie. Many said that Mo went to the well one time too many in his loss against Charlie. After his victories over champion Fargo and his brother Basket, too much was taken out of him to go into a much younger dog like Charlie. The breeding that produced ZEBO and his litter mates was one of those outstanding litters that come only once in a while. Basically, this breeding was a Daibo/Old Family Red-Nose/Colby cross, which explains why all of ZEBO's litter mates were red/red-nosed. But where did this one black dog come from? Many speculate ZEBO wasn't bred as represented, for one Mr. Hughes purchased ZEBO from Lunzo without any papers. Some claimed Mr. Hughes sold many different ZEBOs. And a lot claim ZEBO to be a half-brother to another famous bear, Eli Jr. and Bullison. Although, Lunzo's Andy was a black dog himself and ZEBO threw nothing but black dogs, even when bred to various, different colored females, it still remains a question in a lot of people's minds. Part of the interview with Lester Hughes, the old mountain man. I saw Midnight Cowboy go. He was a little black dog, short and kind of bow-legged. He was a really good dog, one of the best in my opinion. I'd put him in the top 10 of all the dogs I've seen fight. He bit good and hard, not as hard as some dogs I've seen, but hard enough to win. I saw Chivo kill a dog of Billy Collins in less than 30 minutes, God, he was a bulldog. I'd say he was also about one of the best I've seen. Mr. Hughes also named Grand Champion Boomerang as one of the best. He was an ace, he said, but he feels the hardest biting dog he ever saw was Grand Champion ZEBO. Mountain Man Champion Homer was a hard biter, but ZEBO was the hardest. His fights never went very long, which tells you he was biting hard enough to kill his opponents. We asked Mr. Hughes who was the hardest biting dog he's seen since Grand Champion ZEBO, and the hardest biting bitch. The hardest biting dog I've seen in the past 10 years or so would be Champion Homer. As far as I know, no dog ever went a half hour with Homer and lived. He also killed several dogs and rolls before I matched him. The very best and hardest biting bitch I've ever seen is Grand Champion Spooky, out of Homer and Susie. I bred Spooky and schooled her out before selling her to Ricky Jones. The very first time I saw ZEBO, he bit me. Mr. Hughes began. Me and William Cable had come to Lunzo's house to look at his dogs. Lunzo had his dogs tied along a narrow path, and if you got one step the wrong way, they could reach you. I started walking along the path behind Lunzo towards the dogs and stopped and asked him if any of the dogs could get to us. No, and they wouldn't bite, you know how he answered, and we kept walking. We went a few steps further and a black dog hit the end of his chain and grabbed me by the arm. I swung my fist and punched him in the jaw, knocking him off, and that was the very first time I laid eyes on ZEBO. Willie Brown was there with his wife and daughter. He and Lunzo were rolling out a bunch of dogs. They rolled one of Willie's bitches on Lena, that was ZEBO's sister, and then they rolled Vindicator and ZEBO. It was a short roll. The way those dogs were hurting each other, it couldn't have gone very long without them killing each other. Vindicator was really punishing ZEBO's front legs, but ZEBO was hurting Vindicator's nose, putting holes in his muzzle the size of my little finger, and the blood was running all over. Vindicator was Lunzo's favorite, but I asked Willie privately which dog he liked better, and he said he'd seen them both rolled before and he liked ZEBO the best. I liked the dog real good, but I didn't buy ZEBO that day. I went back a couple of months later and Lunzo had rolled ZEBO on a dog that weighed about 85 pounds, I believe. His shoulder had been messed up really bad. Mrs. Hughes adds, his one leg was just sort of hanging there, it looked like it had near about been tore right off. I bought ZEBO and took him home. William Cable took him to his vets and had his shoulder reconstructed. The surgery cost $75, which was a lot of money back then. Lunzo let me have ZEBO on time. I paid him so much one month, then so much another month until it was all paid. He still leads people to believe I still owe him for ZEBO, but I paid him every penny. At a later date I went back and bought 4 female pups from Lunzo, off Mike and Angie, and paid for those on time too. But I held back $20 on each pup when I paid him because Willie Brown told me I'd never see the papers on them, that Lunzo wouldn't spend the money to send for them, and that's the story of the $80 I owe Lunzo Pratt. Out of the 5 dogs I bought from Lunzo I got 3 really good ones. I give him A+ for that. Anytime you buy 5 dogs from a man you're more than likely to get 5 curs than 3 good dogs. Lonesome one too, and another bitch was dead game and died in a kennel fight. Of the 2 didn't work out, one was cold and the other one fought 15 minutes and then quit. After his shoulder was all healed, I matched ZEBO. His first fight was an easy one. The match was against a friend of mine that I'd been in the service with at 40 pounds. The dog he brought was really about a 35-pounder that weighed 40 pounds, and ZEBO killed it in 17 minutes. Bob Finley had a 2-time winner called Pete, and we matched at 42 pounds. Pete had won his fights at a higher weight, and ZEBO came in at 41 3/4, which was too heavy for him. He was a good, strong, hard-hitting dog or he'd have been in trouble. ZEBO killed Pete in 26 minutes. His next was into my friend from the service again, and that was a pretty good fight, but ZEBO won in about 30 minutes and that dog died too. His dog was real game and would have scratched at the end of the fight, if he could have. I don't believe that man messed with any more bulldogs after that. He was into the law pretty heavy, still as if he hasn't retired. And I don't mean he's a deputy sheriff or anything like that, he's up in the top bracket of the law. Junior Bush called and said he had a match for ZEBO in Alabama, against a feller by the name of Ellinger that was into the dogs pretty heavy at that time. We turned him loose, and when that feller seen what was happening, I saw he kinda felt like he'd been set up. He walked over to where I was standing and said that one can kill a dog, can't he? And I replied, yeah, just recently he killed 2. And if you don't pick yours up, he'll kill him too. And ZEBO did, winning the fight in 23 minutes. Dave and Roger Adams had saw ZEBO the day he fought in Alabama. Dave looked him over, pointed to his back end and asked me why he didn't have any scars there. I answered, as far as I know, no dog has ever got to his back end. He called me after the match wanting to buy ZEBO and I told him that I didn't want to sell the dog. He made me an offer, and I made him an offer that I did not believe he would pay for the dog, and that was the end of the conversation. I was eating breakfast the next morning and looked out the window to see Dave Adams' car pull into the yard. He'd come for ZEBO. He wanted to get ZEBO off the chain himself. A few moments later I saw him running away from ZEBO's spot. ZEBO had almost bit him and ran him off. I had to load ZEBO in their car myself. They hadn't brought a box or a crate with them, and when they left ZEBO was riding in the front seat between them, looking out the window. I was wondering if by the time they got to Ohio either of them would have any face left. Mr. Hughes shakes his head, laughing and continues, they matched him into the Greaser dog, who I believe was a 4-time winner. And there was a good story behind that, each side trying to set the other side up. I was supposed to drive up to see the match, but my car broke down somewhere in Virginia, so I just turned around and went back home. About 3 in the morning, the phone rang and it was Dave Adams. I thought ZEBO had quit and jumped the pit, and he must have been really mad at me to call at that hour. He said, "You're never gonna believe what ZEBO did," and before he could say anything else, I told him, "Well, I like him, so just send him back to me if you don't want him." What he'd called for was to tell me that ZEBO had gone 3 pounds uphill and won in just under 2 hours. After that was when Dave Adams' son got hurt, and ZEBO did bite that boy. I saw his face and ZEBO bit him pretty good, and he sold ZEBO to a feller named Johnson. I believe ZEBO won 2 more after that, one against a nephew of his out of Gr.Ch, in 18 minutes. ZEBO was about the hardest biting dog I ever saw, and liked the chest. Once he'd get in the chest, one wasn't gonna get him out of there, and if they did, it would be so weak from the punishment it couldn't do much of anything else anymore. When the dog was going down, ZEBO would get on the front legs, shake so hard it would look like the dog wasn't even touching the ground. He could adopt any style a dog had. If a dog fought the mouth, it wouldn't stay there for long. ZEBO bit so hard the dog would get out of the mouth pretty fast and try something else. When I got him, ZEBO's teeth were worn down flat, but his cutters were as long and thick as my little finger to the second joint, and I'm not exaggerating. He'd kill a dog, and there wouldn't be a drop of blood. I don't remember seeing much blood in any of his fights. I don't believe there would have been much competition in the Gr.Ch match if he hadn't had so much of a weight advantage over ZEBO. They say he survived and was retired to stud, and maybe he was. But I never did hear anyone much more tell of him or any pups off of him. ZEBO would bite. He'd bite you or he'd bite a stranger. Not every time, mind you, there'd be times he was just as friendly as a puppy. But if you walked up to him and his eyes got real wide and round, the only way to keep from getting bit was to get the hell away from him fast. When he bit, he didn't just chomp and turn the hold loose. He'd work it like he was on a dog, hold and shake. One time some big old boy from South Carolina was here to look at the dogs with some friends. I guess he weighed about 250 pounds, big, all muscle, you know? We started to look at the bulldogs, and he went right towards ZEBO. Back then we had him chained out there by the old apple tree. I called after him, "Don't touch that dog, he'll bite you." He answered, "I train dogs for a living, and there ain't a dog in the world that I can't pet." And I told him, "Well, you can't pet that one." He looked at ZEBO and said, "This little dog is friendly, look at the way his tail's a-wagging." I said, "He's just anticipating how good he's gonna enjoy biting you." Me and the other fellers walked up the hill towards the other dogs, and we didn't get but about 10 feet before I heard that boy scream. He was holding his arm up and there was ZEBO hanging from it, shaking. I had to get a breaking stick to get him off. I don't believe there was any way that boy, big as he was, could have got ZEBO off, and eventually ZEBO would have gotten him down. We all laugh and Mrs. Hughes talks about ZEBO. ZEBO was our house dog. That was before we had any children, and he used to ride with us in the car. I'd put him in the back seat, but he'd never stay there. He'd jump into the front seat and sit in my lap, looking out the window and popping his jaws. You know how they do that when they're excited or nervous? He'd scare me sometimes doing that, his head a few inches from my face and those jaws just popping and quivering. It would get so I couldn't stand it anymore, and would just throw him back in the back seat. But he'd just jump right back up between us and climb into my lap again. One day we were on our way somewhere and I was throwing him back, and he was jumping back into my lap, over and over again. Lester got so mad at the two of us fighting, so he hit the brakes, turned around and went back home. He let us both out of the car and drove away. I don't believe you could have reached out with your hand and touched me on the shoulder before ZEBO'd have your finger. Mr. Hughes goes on, "I was walking him in the parking lot before the fight in Alabama, and Junior Bush came up to shake hands with William Cable. When their hands met, ZEBO had both of them by the hand, didn't put much pressure, just grabbed their hands quick." Mr. Hughes turns to his wife, "What match was it? I brought ZEBO home and put him up in the room in the barn, and he tore everything up and ate the telephone." Mrs. Hughes thinks about it, and answers, "I don't remember. But I do remember the time you brought him back from a match with his head swollen up like a melon and his eyes swollen about shut. We had a little black cat at the time, and it was somewhere eye on the house when Lester carried ZEBO in. We didn't think ZEBO could see at all, but as soon as Lester sat him down, he was off. Him tearing after that cat, and me after him, trying to catch him before he caught the cat. Mr. Hughes adds. Another time a bunch of us were driving back from a match with ZEBO. Everyone but the driver fell asleep, and we left ZEBO loose, figuring he was hurt so bad he just lay there and rest. When we woke up, ZEBO had chewed his harness and ate part of it. And chewed my belt right off me while I was asleep and ate part of it. It tickled William Cable to death. He thought it was really funny till he looked around for his sweater to put on. He had one of those expensive sweaters with the leather patches on the elbows. ZEBO had ate every bit of the leather off, and ate the collar off it too. William wasn't laughing anymore after he found his sweater. One time I didn't have much bet on one of ZEBO's fights, so I gave Evelyn all the money to bet. I knowed nobody was gonna bet against me, and you know how people are, they see a dumb-looking woman trying to bet and they'll take the bet. Mrs. Hughes continues, I'd never bet on a fight, and didn't know how. Everyone was calling out bets and I just stood there. ZEBO won in less than half an hour and I hadn't got a single nickel bet. We asked Mr. Hughes what ZEBO produced while he had him, and why in his opinion, ZEBO is not known as a very good producer. I never bred ZEBO to any outside bitches while I had him, but I did breed him to 2 or 3 bitches here. I bred him to a bitch of Bruce King's and we got some good ones. One got poisoned, one hung itself, and 2 accidentally drowned. I believe they would have been winners. I bred him to Lonesome, and got a bunch of good dogs that I never could get matched. They were all about his size. Gator was one of them, and he was about the closest thing to ZEBO that I ever saw as far as mouth went. I rolled him on his brother Blue, who was another good one, but Gator ruined him. He literally tore off part of his muzzle, teeth, bone and all. Blue never recovered and I finally had to put him to sleep. I didn't match Gator because he got loose and got on a dog on a chain down by the river. I had a broken leg at the time and couldn't get there fast enough to break it up before Gator's teeth were ruined. I believe there was another one in that litter I called Little ZEBO, a real good little dog that I sold to someone in the vicinity of Lenoir, North Carolina. But I lost track of that one. I got 5 males off ZEBO that I thought would be really good dogs but never did get a chance to match, and I got a good percentage of cold dogs that wouldn't hit a lick. Jack Swinson had that ZEBO Jr. dog that you see a picture of in the Big Stratton book. He was a really rough dog, but from what I understand he didn't turn out. I have pictures of him somewhere, fighting a boomerang dog, and you can see the blood just pouring down the dog's leg from his shoulder where ZEBO Jr. was biting him. But I believe Jack Swinson told me the dog quit. They bred ZEBO a lot in Ohio, and I guess for the number of bitches he was bred to he didn't produce all that well. I know that I've had more ZEBO dogs disappoint me than any other line. Though one of the biggest problems I had with them was weak teeth. At least 1 out of every 3 ZEBO dogs I rolled would lose its teeth. Bill Stepp had some dogs off ZEBO, Willie and Ruby, that were really good. And Larry Combs told me that if he turned in all the wins he'd had with ZEBO dogs, it would have put ZEBO at the top of the Register of Merit list. We asked Mr. Hughes if he thought there were any ZEBO-bred dogs still alive that he thought were of ZEBO's caliber, and his reply was, I never saw McGee's Panther fight, but from what everyone has told me of his ability, that did see him go, I believe he's the closest thing to Grand Champion ZEBO that's around today. Part of the interview with Dave Adams. The hardest fight I have ever seen was when Champion ZEBO went into Champion Gr.Ch. He was owned by the Fowlers. They had secretly purchased Gr.Ch, who was said to be the best in the country at his weight. They thought to trap Adams and Hudson's Tex. Gr.Ch had a much bigger reputation than ZEBO. The Fowlers were not one bit afraid of ZEBO. They were sure they were going to win. This match was originally between Dean Hudson, who was supposed to use his Tex dog. Tex was sired by Bullison out of Arts Missy. They had trouble with Tex during the keep, and had the choice of paying the forfeit or using ZEBO in Tex's place. Now Gr.Ch had won 4 matches, 3 of them over top dogmen. ZEBO had also won 4. Gr.Ch got his name for his ability to slip and break holds. He was a clever wrestler. Adams felt he didn't have enough time to get ZEBO into shape, and told Hudson he would pick up in 30 minutes if ZEBO wasn't winning. Adams said he had the sweat coming out of him in this match, as ZEBO tried to get a hold and couldn't. As Gr.Ch was slipping and sliding, avoiding holds. Along the way ZEBO was taking a lot of punishment as he did not try to protect himself. He was a straight-ahead, hard-driving dog. He had one thought in his mind, and that was to kill his opponent as quick as possible. ZEBO was a straight-chest dog, and any other hold he got, he would spit out. His teeth were worn down, but he was game and determined, and he had his work cut out for him. They took turns being top dog. Then ZEBO's mouth started to bring him ahead. Gr.Ch's chest looked as if someone had shot him with a 12-gauge shotgun. He started to weaken, and ZEBO was deep in the chest, rooting. Gr.Ch started to sag in his corner when the Fowlers conceded. They were gentlemen and they shook my hand and congratulated me and my dog.